Sensitive content warning. The following video contains discussion and visuals from R-rated movies and spoilers for The Turning and The Innocents, as well as based opinions. Continue at your own discretion. Don't watch The Turning. It is a terrible movie, and if you click away now, I'd be okay knowing that you've left with that piece of information. Back to the video, aside from an apology that I have to make about my abysmal upload schedule, I have a confession to make. In my previous video, while I did conduct my review of The Boogeyman, I never actually delved into any detail about why I felt it was a good adaptation, besides in the end where I said I think it did a good job.
What have I done?
Which is way too vague for my liking, so here's a quick recap. The original story was too short to make into a feature-length film. If the story was going to debut on the big screen with any level of success, the story needed to be reworked. The movie starts with a sequence that closely follows the original story and quickly moves away from it. By placing the events of the short story in the movie in this way, it is enough fan service to those who have read the book, but doesn't hinder the direction the narrative is free to go. I understand that a lot can go into making a great adaptation great, but for the purposes of this video, a great adaptation is great because it doesn't lose sight of what made its predecessor work so well. Anyways, back to this video.
You take two or more, you combine them together, add a bit of spice, trim it down, whammo, you got a new idea.
Both of these movies are based on The Turn of the Screw, a novella published in 1898. The book was set in 1840s Victorian England. I've read this book once through and it is very fascinating. Brief synopsis of the book. Mrs. Giddens takes a job as a governess, a tutor or teacher who lives on the property to teach a little girl. She was only meant to take care of the little girl, but one day she receives a letter saying that the older brother, who is attending a boarding school, will be returning home because he has been expelled. Upon their brother's return, strange occurrences begin popping up all over the house. As Miss Giddens has more sightings of these ghosts, she comes to the realization that the two ghosts that she is seeing over and over again are the people who lived in the house previously, Mrs. Jessel and Quint. Mrs. Jessel was the previous governess, and Quint was the groundskeeper. One day, while Quint was drunk, he slipped and hit his head. Unalived. Miss Jessel was madly in love with Quint, despite him being an abusive drunkard, and fell into a deep depression after his death and unalived herself. She believes that Mrs. Jessel and Quint are trying to possess the children to regain their physical bodies to reunite their love once more. I will delve into further detail as necessary, but this is a very general overview of what happens in the book and roughly both movies.
How do I love thee? Let me count the waves.
This is a phenomenal film. I showed it to a friend of mine who didn't pick up on the more subtle messages, but found it enjoyable. I found that masterpieces have this quality, where they're able to be appreciated on multiple levels. You start on the surface and can marvel at the piece as a whole, but the more you analyze and dig deeper, you begin to notice smaller and smaller details that contribute to the masterpiece as a whole, gaining a new appreciating for the artist's thoughtful craft. This movie carries that same quality. Every tiny detail builds towards the story and overarching themes. More than recreating every scene perfectly, The Innocents captures that uneasy feeling of being isolated in a huge mansion. The Innocents is consistently asking you a question. Is Mrs. Giddens actually seeing ghosts?
I see dead people.
There are a few openings in horror films that set such a strong tone and almost act as a scare right out the gate. We begin at the end with Mrs. Giddens praying while we hear someone singing "O Willow Wally," which for copyright reasons I'm afraid to show, but it sets the atmosphere of this movie perfectly. There's a brilliant, subtle, recurring motif surrounding the film. As more and more disturbing things occur throughout the story, we are shown white roses. At the beginning of the film, Mrs. Giddens sees a vase of white roses set out on a table. She touches them only for most of the petals to fall off. A perfect exterior with a sickness inside. A perfect metaphor that works in both ways. The roses could be a metaphor for Mrs. Giddens' mental state, as it shows that she is perfect on the outside, but her mind inside is broken. Alternatively, it could represent the children. A wholesome outside with a secret, terrible inside. Flora said out of the blue that Miles, her older brother, would be coming home soon. This didn't make any sense because he was at boarding school and wouldn't be coming home. However, the next day, Mrs. Giddens received a letter that he had been expelled for being an injury to the other students. This came at such a shock that the housekeeper, Mrs. Groves, couldn't believe it. The thing here is that we, the audience, never read the letter. And Mrs. Giddens is the only character in the story that actually reads this letter. Later, during the climax of the film, Mrs. Giddens accuses Miles of being expelled, and he never outright admits what he did or whether or not he was actually expelled or not. So which is it? Was Miles expelled, or did Mrs. Giddens' mind make it up? The first time Mrs. Giddens sees a ghost is when she's in the garden looking up at a tower. We don't see who it is very well, and when she gets to the top of the tower, she doesn't see anyone except for Miles. A little later in the film, Mrs. Giddens sees the same man through a window up close, this time through extreme detail. However, shortly before this, we, the audience, and Mrs. Giddens were shown a detailed picture of Quint. Later, in a dream sequence, we see the same tower scene play out again, except we can see Quint clear as day on top of the tower. Is this the ghosts becoming more ambitious and getting closer to Mrs. Giddens, or is it her mind forming a more complete image of the man after seeing more and more pictures of him? Every instance Mrs. Giddens sees a ghost, it is shrouded in this ambiguity that could go either way. Is she actually seeing ghosts, or is her mind constructing stronger illusions based off of the details that she is learning as the story progresses? A quick side note, this is some of the best child acting I've ever seen. This is by far the hardest role written for a child that I've ever seen, and the kids knock it out of the park, especially during Miles's monologue where he recites a poem. I mean, holy shit. I'm trying to think of a stronger child performance and I'm struggling. Even the title is genius. There are no bad guys. Everyone is just doing their part. Even the ghosts, if they are real, just want to be together and love each other. Everyone in this movie is innocent. I could go on talking about how great this movie is and delving into tinier and tinier details, but this video has to keep moving, so...
What the f*** is this piece of shit?
Alright, before I start bashing on this movie, let me begin with listing what I enjoy about the film. The special effects are pretty good, and the casting of Finn Wolfhard is genius. He plays the role of creepy, snot-nosed kid perfectly. I seriously don't think anyone else could have fulfilled that role as perfectly as he did. Okay, now that I've said everything that I have to say about the film's strengths, let's get into the rest of this review. If you're worried about spoilers for this movie, get the out. I cannot reiterate how terrible this film is and how not worth anyone's time it is. This film fails on so many fundamental levels of being a horror film outside of being an adaptation. There's so much wrong with this film that it's hard to diagnose and pinpoint all the different things that went wrong. It's a chain reaction of big and little problems coming together in this terrible cacophony of a movie. It is difficult to put into words how much I hate this movie without cussing for 10 minutes straight.
English, motherfucker, do you speak it?
When people say they don't like jump scares in movies, it isn't an invitation for you to call them a wuss. Jump scares are seen industry-wide as cheap. They feel unearned. It's so easy to just make something feel scary when it's really loud and jumping at the screen. I had someone complain to me that they didn't like Smile, full analysis of that movie in the works, because they said that they didn't like jump scares, to which I promptly called them a wuss. Okay, but why am I okay with jump scares in Smile but not the turning? Simple. In Smile, they're earned. There's a simple build-up to each scare. In every instance of what can be qualified as a jump scare in Smile, there's enough foreshadowing of what is coming that as an audience, we don't feel cheated into feeling scared. In The Turning, on the other hand, every scary moment that occurs in The Turning, with one or two exceptions, is a jump scare. The first real scare of the movie comes at 20 minutes and 5 seconds in, where we see one of the reflections in a window. No joke, within the same minute, at 20 minutes and 54 seconds, we are given another jump scare. It isn't earned, it feels cheap and is incredibly annoying. I counted a total of 14 jump scares, and with a runtime of 94 minutes, that is a jump scare every 6.8 minutes, which is hilarious. Why? The original had zero things that could be classified as a jump scare. Jump scares have their place in the genre. I get having jump scares in a film about a serial killer or a murderer or whatever. Jump scares have zero business being in what is meant to be a slow burn thriller ghost film. This movie took everything that made The Innocents good and ruined it.
Do you even know how paper is made? It's not like steel. You don't put it into a furnace. If you put paper into a furnace, you know what would happen? You'd ruin it.
So The Innocents, as we've established, was about a subtle story where the ghosts might actually be there or might actually be in the character's imagination. As a result, everything is shrouded in this vagueness and mystery, but the turning is hell-bent on shattering every shred of subtlety that the story can hold. Let's analyze the writing. Even at points where there was a good line with a lot of subtext, they beat you over the head at the end with what they wanted to say. And here's a great example.
Interior kitchen, morning. The faucet is rhythmically dripping into a bowl in the sink, while Kate is staring into a vintage television when she sees a figure come into view from behind her. A large envelope is tossed on the table in front of her. This came for you. The envelope has the name Darla written on it. Kate grabs it and notices the seal has been broken. Did you open my mail? It came like that. Who is Darla? Kate tightens her grip on the envelope. My mother. Oh, I see. Well, we can't choose our family. Mrs. Groves begins to leave the room, but lingers at the door while Kate opens the envelope, revealing paper that has been entirely scribbled black with charcoal. Whatever your mother has, let's hope it's not genetic. Mrs. Groves leaves the room while Kate continues to flip through her mother's drawings. Why did we need the second line? It completely ruined all of the wonderful subtext that we got from the previous line. There's no, I don't understand why she needed to say, whatever your mother has, let's hope it's not genetic. I mean, everything that was said in that line was the subtext of, oh, I see, well, we can't choose our family. Like, there's so many brilliant things. Like, why couldn't the scene have just played out like this? Interior kitchen, morning. The faucet is rhythmically dripping into a bowl in the sink, while Kate is staring into a vintage television when she sees a figure come into view from behind her. A large envelope is tossed on the table in front of her. We see it has the name Darla written on the envelope. This came for you. Who is Darla? Kate tightens her grip on the envelope. My mother. Oh, I see. Kate opens the letter, revealing the paper that has been entirely scribbled black with charcoal. Mrs. Groves stands up to leave after seeing the first page. Kate remains fixated on the drawings. I guess we can't choose our family. Mrs. Groves leaves the room while Kate continues to flip through her mother's drawings. The improvement added to the scene isn't that I added anything to it, it's just that I reshaped what was already there. Like, there's pieces throughout this film that could have made it good, but then they just kept adding things and just kept making it worse.
Not only is this infinitely better, but this is something that could have been edited together in post. This film is full of scenes like this, where they add details and just beat you over the head with whatever the subtext was supposed to be. Why does Flora casually mention that her dolls tell her fun facts? That never happened in the original. Why can't Flora leave the grounds? That was never mentioned anywhere, not in the book, not in the original movie. Why is Mrs. Groves horrible to Mrs. Giddens? In the original book and movie, they were on the same team, and it wasn't until the third act that Mrs. Groves became suspicious that Mrs. Giddens was going mad. It seems that from the get-go in this movie, Mrs. Groves was against Mrs. Giddens. Not only this, but the entire time, everyone except for Flora is antagonistic towards her. For what reason? This never happened. By making all of these things that are happening more weird, it serves only to make Mrs. Giddens the most normal person in the whole house. This was supposed to be about her going insane. The whole point was everyone was just a little off, and seeing ghosts made her believe that the children could see them as well. But we're just lying to her. There is no justification for any of this in the film other than she was crazy the whole time. The ending has Finn Wolfhard basically look into the camera and say, she's broken. You can't fix what is broken. This rant is something that I'm extremely passionate about, if you couldn't already tell. It's just so frustrating that they were going off of such strong source material, but managed to fail at essentially every step along the way. It's funny too, because I saw the turning in some horror trailer compilation, so I watched it and thought, wow, that was terrible. Then I did some digging and discovered that this was not just a bad movie, but it's terrible because of what it was trying to be. In all honesty though, I have to say that I'm glad the turning exists, because if it didn't, I don't think I would ever have discovered The Innocents. Not only this, but a large part of this YouTube channel's creation was so I could eventually make this video and post this rant to the internet, because I love The Innocents so much. But the turning sucks so bad, and the fact that they have to share any resemblance to each other is a crying shame. But if you haven't already watched The Innocents, I highly recommend watching it.
This video has taken long enough to edit together, so thank you for watching. This has been Last Minute Productions. See you next time.